How's it
Yeah,
going, everyone? Mufar here. Welcome to Helioptis Radio. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by Ellen Busch. She's the author of Empowered, and she's here to tell us a bit about herself and also hopefully about her book. And so, without further ado, thank you so much, Ellen. Tell us about yourself. What has the journey of life led you to doing what it is that you're doing now?
sure. And thank you for taking the time to speak with me. So my book, disEmpowered with the DIS crossed out. So my journey really began, or my challenges really began when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I was diagnosed as dyslexic. And unfortunately, when I went through the school system, that was an academic death sentence, and it was interpreted as having an intellectual disability, which is false. And, one of the reasons I'm telling my story is I want people to understand, if you are dyslexic, you do not have an intellectual disability. Your brain just simply works differently. And I was fortunate because I had parents who just didn't accept this academic death sentence, and they fought for me. There was a parent-teacher conference when I was 6, 7 years old, right around that time frame. And an administrator told my parents that college was out of the question. I might be able to finish high school, but I would not be contributing to society other than as a wife and a mother. And they should focus on finding a husband who would take care of me.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's pretty
that's
awful.
that's Yeah, that's very tough, especially at a young age. I also had quite a few learning difficulties myself, ADHD, not as sharp as everyone, having to take extra time on problems. So I don't understand fully, but to a certain extent, it is difficult to have that limitation. I wouldn't call it limitation, but that difference from those around you. And so I was actually going to ask, in terms of living with dyslexia, so what is dyslexia for those that don't know it, and what are some of the implications of I guess, handling dyslexia, or how people function to their day-to-day lives with it?
Sure. It's a great question. So, today we're understanding more and more about it. And what it really comes down to is it's a processing difference.
Mm-hmm.
And our brains just work differently. And there is a little bit of a trade-off. I have very little short-term memory. But my long-term memory, the trade-off is excellent. So it's kind of like we're built with a database. We just remember facts and figures and numbers and things like that. But when you're a child, especially in primary school, you are focused on memorizing your times tables, memorizing your spelling words, memorizing, it's a lot of memorization. And that is incredibly difficult when you don't have a good long-term memory. Another term that I hear used today, which is very common, is neurodiverse. And, when I went through the school system, there was a very narrow box, if you will. And that if you didn't fit into that box, there was a problem. And that's really unfortunate because it doesn't allow for neurodiversity. And I think it's something we're getting much better at. But again, the perception is that dyslexic people are stupid, or they're lazy, or they're just, they're not paying attention, or they're not interested. And that's just not the case. Another perspective or thing that I have learned about myself is that I'm a very visual thinker.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think in words, I think in pictures. And this is very common among people who are dyslexic. And I've been playing with a hypothesis that I believe that language is not our first language. Our first language is visual thinking. We think in pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to learn that step of turning our pictures into language. And that sometimes takes a little bit of time.
It does.
Go
Yes,
ahead, I'm sorry.
continue. No, no, continue. Sorry, I was just commenting. I was saying it does. I agree with your statement there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, Einstein was dyslexic, and I don't think there's anybody who understands who he was that would believe that he had an intellectual disability.
Mhm.
But yet he was a late talker and he was a very visual thinker. And he wrote and talked about um, how he would play with ideas and mathematical equations in his mind, but in a visual sense.
Mhm.
So that's really an excellent example of really how dyslexia is can actually be a gift. It can be a talent. And it's just a different way of seeing the world and processing information.
And so I was actually going to ask, well, I think I'll use these questions to lead into. I'll actually just start off with, how did it affect your self-confidence growing up and obviously moving into adulthood as well? Has it always
Sure.
been something that a lot of people, because once you're out of school, you're free. You can pretty much do anything. So all the stigmas that
Right.
were placed upon you while you're in high school or while you're in preschool, all those notions fall off and you kind of forget about, whatever issues you had when you're younger. So
Right.
I just wondering how that maybe was with you.
Well, for me, unfortunately, all through the school system, I was treated as a second class citizen. And for me, it was traumatic. And it really destroyed my self confidence and my self esteem. And in my case, I carried that into adulthood because I didn't know anything else. Now, fortunately, my parents really fought hard against that, and they gave me a lot of tools and a lot of experiences to help me to grow my self confidence and to find places where I could be successful. And, you know, my father really understood that the most important learning happens outside of the classroom.
Okay.
And as a very young child, we had a summer home on the South Shore of Long Island, a small island called Fire Island. And my dad was an avid fisherman. And as a very little girl, he taught me how to navigate, how to read nautical charts, how to use a compass, how to read the water, read the buoys. And that helped with my self confidence. And at 15, he sent me on Outward Bound, which I absolutely loved.
Mhm.
And at 17, he gave me the opportunity to become a certified scuba diver.
Wow, that's really
So,
cool.
yeah. So lots of outdoor adventures, but he understood that doing those kinds of things were building confidence and building, you know, building my self-esteem. And then I could take that into the classroom and, you know, really fight back against all of these messages that were being given to me that I was a second class citizen and that I would never be successful. And you know what? They got it wrong because I did go on to college and I actually have a master's degree as well. So,
Wow,
yeah,
I'm not saying wow, and I'm surprised, but just the fact that you achieved that despite all the stigmas that were placed on you, is really incredible. And that actually leads into my next question, was finding a passion. I was gonna ask, how did the dyslexia help you find out more about what it is that you actually love to do? In terms of just how did it shift your focus internally to not only figure out more about yourself, your strengths, who you are as an individual, but what it is that you actually want to do with your life.
sure. So it taught me, well, I'm going to back up a little bit here because I think there's an important part of the story that I'd like to share. So, unfortunately, with my low self esteem and low self worth, I ended up in an abusive marriage. And had to get myself out of that. I was able to escape that. Um, and I was, again, severely traumatized. And I actually reached my surrender point and just turned myself over to a higher power and said, okay, I'm all yours. I don't know what else to do here. And that's when I got to work. And that's when I got to work and I focused on my healing. I focused on, started to ask questions like, why did this happen? How did I end up in this situation?
Mm.
And I was not willing to repeat those mistakes. So I knew I had to ask hard questions and get help and support. And I worked with coaches and therapists. So where that has led me, to answer your question, is that I have discovered that these experiences are, and what I have learned, are very important. And it's the reason why I've written the book, because I want to share what I've learned, not just with people who are dyslexic, but anybody who's been in an abusive situation. You know, how does this happen? How do you deal with trauma? How do you heal from these things? So my focus now is I'm taking a coaching certification class, and I have several people who I'm coaching right now. I have a regular full-time job, but coaching, using the coaching method and incorporating that with the life lessons that I have received is really my purpose. You know, I was completely disempowered as a child, and I learned to become empowered. And along that process, I learned to heal, I learned to ask for help, and I learned to thrive again. And that's what's really important, is learning how to thrive after recovering from a really difficult life event. And I think a lot of people may survive something terrible, but then they get stuck. They don't know what to do. And they don't necessarily move through the healing process, or they don't know how to thrive and create the life that they want on their terms. And that's something I've learned to do.
And so I just actually wanted to come back on that one. Firstly, thank you for
Sure.
sharing that. And what does it look like to take back power for yourself? How did you
Yeah.
find strength in, again, you said you obviously shifted out of your marriage, which obviously is not it's not an easy thing. But how did you find strength in choosing to be alone again? And what did the process look like in finding that strength to rebuild yourself and your life? Not necessarily on your terms, but on your heart-centered desires.
Sure. So when I got away from my ex-husband, I asked for help. You know, I went to work with therapists and coaches, and I learned how to take care of myself. I knew that I couldn't just jump into another relationship without going through a healing process, because I was just going to repeat the same thing over again. And I was lucky to have survived and gotten out alive, and because a lot of people don't. And it's not just women, it's men as well. Obviously, statistically, it's more women. But it does happen to men as well. And I just wasn't willing to live that way anymore. And it was so painful and so traumatic that I had a choice. And the choice was to find ways to heal and get better, or not survive. And please don't misunderstand me. I never for a moment considered harming myself. That never entered into my psyche. But I just knew if I continued on the path that I was on, that I was going to be in serious danger, or I was going to be dealing with a serious illness because of the stress. And that happens to people. So I just wasn't willing to give up on myself. And I chunked it into what we call micro goals. And I just took one step at a time. And getting into therapy and healing and learning meditation and breath work and all of these things, I started to feel better a little bit at a time. And I just knew I had to keep going down that path and things would get better. And it did. And it was little steps at a time. Okay, I feel better. I feel better today. I feel better today. Okay, I know I'm going to feel a little bit better tomorrow. And I just kept going.
Really beautifully said. It's really beautifully said. And again, yeah, my utmost respect for choosing the process. I find that even with myself, that, choosing the process is the most difficult part. It's probably where, when people are the most stuck, that's where they really struggle, because the process is tough. And
It is.
there's a lot of other things that come with it, but again, it's always good to hear from someone who's on the opposite end of it, looking back now,
Sure.
just seeing how that process is. So, go ahead.
And I think a lot of the fear comes from facing the unknown. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know that they can break it into micro goals. They don't know what it's like to talk with a therapist and revisit their traumas. And that is frightening. It is very frightening. And most people run in the opposite direction. But that's when you can really become empowered. And you can say, no, I'm going to face my trauma. And when I take it on, I win. And if you don't, trauma will win. And trauma will be in control. And I just wasn't willing to do that.
Wow. And in terms of writing your book, Disempowered or Empowered, with this scratched out, what was I like? What upon the inspiration to write it, and how was it?
Yeah.
Did you find that even writing the book in of itself was a healing process for you?
Absolutely, it was. It was completely cathartic. It took a very long time to write. It took about 5 years to write.
Wow.
And I worked with a writing coach. Her name is Kate Gray, and she's an award-winning poet and novelist. And she and I would work, we'd meet every 2 weeks, and I would work on a chapter and I would send it to her, and she would work with me and, like, oh, let's expand here, and, let's compress this, or, she just really guided me through the process, but it was my words. And that was important to me. And when I got to the publishing process, it was really interesting because we submitted the book for the last 90 days of the publishing process. You have to submit a manuscript and no changes can be made. It's just because they have to typeset it, they have to get it set up for the whole printing process, and that's just the final piece of it. And when that process is done, they send you a copy. And I came home from skiing for the weekend, and there was an Amazon package at the door, and I opened it up, and there was my book.
Wow.
And I was holding it in my hands, and I couldn't believe I held it in my hands. And I was in shock. And my publisher called me and she said, "How are you doing? Are you okay?" Because publishing a very deeply personal story is frightening. And it is powerful. And I said, I don't know what I'm feeling. I don't really understand. And I was in shock for 2 weeks. And I realized, and as I held this in my hand and just couldn't believe that I had accomplished it. And then I realized that I had beaten the system. I beat the education system that tried to tell me I was incapable, brain damaged, stupid, and just not successful. And I beat them. And I beat them by their own standards. So you want to say cathartic? It was absolutely cathartic. It was amazing. I mean, to open that package, open that Amazon envelope and have this in there was just mind-boggling. So.
Well, it's beautiful to hear. It's a beautiful, beautiful story.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, how can people reach out to you in terms of the coaching that you do? I know it's a bit tricky now because obviously I'm based in South Africa, very far from where you are. But do you work with people outside of the US, or since you're kind of still getting the system going for yourself, is it you're just working with locals mainly currently and then perhaps choosing to expand at a later stage?
I would love to work with anybody in the world, and I will make it work. We can figure out a time zone. I did a podcast in Melbourne. And I have a dear friend in Singapore, and you know, you can usually find a time frame that works for both people. So right now I'm just coaching with locally, but I'm happy to talk to anybody who would like to reach out to me. I have a website,
Yes.
and it's ellenbusch.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn, and Instagram is ebush1500, and then of course Facebook. So
I'll make sure to put the links in the description so that people know, and I'll also put it in the video so that you can see.
thank you.
And also in terms of your book, accessing the book, we have a completely different system here. I know you have Barnes and Noble, Indigo Books. We don't actually have that here.
Okay.
Amazon is here. It's a bit tricky though. Sometimes they deliver, sometimes they don't. Is
Oh
there,
no.
sometimes they don't, but is there an ebook version or is it mainly
Um,
hard copy right now?
yeah, there is an ebook version on Amazon. And we are in production right now of doing the audiobook, so it will be on Audible. Estimated time is end of May, beginning of June. I don't have a firm date as of yet. But that's being handled. I chose a company to produce that for me. So I will not be reading it, but it will be professionally narrated. And one of the things that was really important to me was whatever I put out there, it must be professional. I have seen people do self-publishing works. Having a professional editor, professional
I,
publisher
I hear you. I hear you
is,
on that.
it matters.
It's a better avenue, probably more expensive though. So I can understand the
Yes,
self-publishing route for a lot of people. I've interviewed a few authors. A
of
lot of the
course.
times it's not feasible for them, but I agree with you having it, thoroughly vetted and again edited where there might be any certain things. It's definitely the best way
Exactly.
moving forward. And looking at the book cover, it looks really well done. It looks really good just
Thank
from
you.
this side. So yeah, you can put it up again. It looks and the photo even
I
better.
can't
Even
resist. I'm sorry.
no, no, even better. Um,
You know, and the other piece of it too was the publishing industry is an industry I knew nothing about. And I needed help to navigate that. And again, it's about being comfortable with asking for help. And I found the right publisher and the right person to help me. Her name is Jessica Buchanan, and it's Soul Speak Press. And she's a rather famous American. And the reason why she is famous is she was an aid worker and teacher in Somalia back in 2012, and she was kidnapped
oh
and held
wow, wow.
hostage, yep, for 93 days. And then she was very sick at the time. Her captors made her do proof of life videos. And President Obama gave the order, and SEAL Team 6 went in and rescued her, and another
That's
Danish family,
incredible. So
or Dutch, yeah.
that was the movie Captain, was it? No, Captain Phillips was separate, but was it not based on
Yes,
that? Oh, she was
it
actually
was. Go ahead.
no, sorry, she was actually involved in that event. That's
It
quite
was. She was. It was a separate event from Captain Phillips, but it was. It was a year or two apart. I'm not sure exactly when that event happened, but she was. She was rescued by SEAL Team 6, and one of the things that she kind of worked through when she was held captive is she decided or realized that her purpose is to raise up women's voices
hmm.
and to be a publisher and tell women's stories. Now, she does work with men too, of course, but that was why and how I ended up working with her, because that's a perfect fit for me.
Yeah.
So, and we were a perfect fit for each other, but she's an amazing woman and by her own right. So,
Incredible how the stars align. And I guess the last
yes,
question I was going to ask was, what are your words of wisdom and advice for the audience tuning in today?
I am really becoming an advocate for, I like to use the term emotional health. it's really important to deal with traumas and things that have happened to you. They bleed into other places in your life. They affect your relationships. They affect your family. They affect your job, your employability. And a lot of people don't understand that. And it's not a sign of weakness to face these things or to have had these things happen. This is the world is tough and things happen to us and they hurt sometimes. And again, when you face these things, you own them. Otherwise, they will own you.
Powerful.
Yeah, it is.
Uh,
And then you are empowered because you own it.
Ellen, it's been an absolute honor, firstly, and a joy to have you on the podcast. Your story is really quite inspiring, and
Thank
the
you.
way you convey yourself and the level of sobriety that you have in terms of just how you figured out your problems, it's really, really a sign that you put in the work, and it's now working for you. It's now
Yes,
for
yes,
you.
it pays dividends.
It is good. So I hope for those that tune in, I'm sure someone can take something and take some level of inspiration. Obviously, everyone's life journey is ultimately different, but we can always
Absolutely.
take and lean from one another in terms of how we can
Mhm.
move forward. So it'll be great to have you on again at some point in time. Really,
I'd love to.
delight. Yeah. See, so I'm sure you sound like a very active person in your own life. So I'm sure there are projects that you're working on the horizon that you probably may want to share at a later stage in time.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I
no,
would love to.
it's been really good. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor.